Well, greetings to all our colleagues who are pouring in as numbers that I can see at the bottom of my screen. I don't even know what the right etiquette is anymore because you can't see people. You can just see numbers changing on your screen. So you presume somewhere on this World Wide Web you're getting together. And if you are, there's at the moment about 170 of you and pouring in by the dozens. My name is Shitij Kapur. I'm the President and Vice-Chancellor of King's College London. And you are at today's webinar, which is called Financial Failure in Higher Education. What would happen if a university became insolvent? I think we could ask that question in plural today. What would happen if a few universities became insolvent? Well, this event is a part of our ongoing series. The series is called The Future of Higher Education. It's an initiative that we've undertaken here at King's in collaboration with our Policy Institute at King's. And we're doing a number of things through this initiative. There is, of course, original research and analysis, and I would point you to our website, and someone will put a link where you can go and track this series. And you could say some very fine work done by Professor Alison Wolf, looking at how the different nations are dealing with this issue of fees and universities differently. There's some original survey and polling data, which tells you what the public thinks of all of these issues. But the third and most important thing we do is convene experts. And that is precisely what we are doing today. It's experts on the issue of what might financial failure in higher education look like. And if you thought that the problem was complex enough, let me tell you, it's gotten even more complex in the last few months. Because of the changes to the visa regime, there are some predictions, and these are only predictions, that the number of international students coming to the UK in terms of fees volume may decrease by anything between 1 billion to 2 billion. Now, you can do the math as to the number of jobs it might mean and what might mean for university finances. And if you think that the only issue is, well, it relates to teaching, so they just close the courses for which they're not students, you would not understand the intricate interdependence between education and research. There is such a level of interdependence that if education is affected in a long way, research at universities will never be the same. So the question before us today is both critical and complex. What happens when the immediate financial changes reach a critical point, not only for an institution, but for us as a sector? How would we navigate a scenario where an English university, but how about if more than one English university runs out of cash? And crucially, is our current insolvency legislation, which really hasn't been, and it's a good thing, hasn't been tested extensively, equipped to handle such a situation? Not easy questions. We hope to generate some answers, but if not, certainly to generate some awareness and debate about the issue. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor Dame Alison Wolf, who will be chairing our discussion today, to introduce the wonderful panelists. And I will record, this is now about 250 of you who are attending. So to welcome to all of you, and over to Alison. Alison.
Thank you very much, Shitij, and welcome to everybody who is listening, and welcome to those of you who are going to hear the recording at a later date. I think this is indeed an issue which is going to run for a while, hopefully not forever, but also something where I'm conscious that there are decisions looming which will be important for politicians, MPs, and indeed for the major economic players in this country, as well as for individual universities. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our panelists. Damien Ashford, who is Partner Education Lead and Government and Health Industries Restructuring Leader at PwC UK. Neil Smyth, Partner at Mills and Reeves. Professor Sir Steve West, who is Vice-Chancellor, President and CEO of University West England, Bristol, and also Jess Lister, Associate Director, Public First. So we have the financial view, the legal view, the sector view, the political view, and I'm going to start with Damien and ask him, looking with a cold financial PwC eye, to say a little bit about the level of risk facing the sector. How serious is it? And is this just a general low-level risk that we somehow have to all respond to? Or are there factors here which go beyond that and which might mean that we really are in a situation of insolvency and restructuring?
Alison, thank you. What I want to start with is really zooming in on what we mean by insolvency in this context. So we're talking about an institution or institutions not being able to meet their debts as they fall due. So let's now start talking about some of the factors which have been impacting that level of risk in the sector, and there'll be many which you are very familiar with. So the sector has been experiencing financial headwinds for a number of years, including the erosion in real terms of the domestic fee cap. That and many other risks and factors are called out in some of the recent reports which have been published in the last 12 months, including the PwC UK work. So those headwinds have been increasing the scale and the prevalence of deficits in the sector and reducing its liquidity, so the availability of cash. And remember that definition of insolvency I mentioned at the start. Secondly, we've got an increase in risk in the sector because of the growth in international students. Now, those international students have been given this substantial economic benefits to institutions and the sector more widely in the UK as a whole, but we are actually quite dependent on them economically. And when we published that work in January of this year with the UK, that showed that the sector is highly vulnerable and fragile to a drop in international students. Roll forwards to the May OFS report that signalled a potential decrease in this academic year of 40% or more. The third and final factor I want to call out, which is affecting this risk of insolvency, is all about the variability in the financial resilience of institutions in the sector. So because insolvency affects institutions rather than sectors in terms of how it applies, we need to look at that variability in financial strength of institutions in the sector. And we've got some really financially strong institutions, but we've also got some which are at the other end of the spectrum. And it's those that we're really concerned about. And it's the risk of insolvency of an individual institution, as well as the knock-on consequence, some call it the domino effect or contagion risk, about if one goes into insolvency, could it be a second and a third and a fourth? Because if one goes, it will impact creditors, lenders, staff, students, and a whole set of other critically important stakeholders, and we could have a ripple effect going across the sector. So I wouldn't say, Alison, to your question, it's a low-level risk. This is a very real and current risk, even though I hope many institutions that are the most challenged have many months to go before they reach that point, hopefully a year or two, but it's really difficult to tell for sure.
Could I just ask you a little bit more about the institutions that are going to be most at risk? Because we have this tendency, I think, to say, oh, well, it's just a function of how many overseas students and whether you can maintain the numbers. My sense is that it's more complicated than that. There are issues of capital costs, there are issues of interconnectedness between teaching and research, as Shitij noted. It's not simply, the smallest, apparently weakest are the most vulnerable.
Alison, exactly that. It's not the case of the smallest. There is a size factor in here, but there is many other, I think, more important factors affecting those that are most challenged. The first is, if you go back 5-10 years, how strong the balance sheets were. So how financially resilient were they before they started hitting some of the most difficult headwinds? We also have other factors affecting institutions as well, such as where they are in the quality of their teaching. One of the things we've seen in the last few months is what I call a flight to even higher quality, because we have some institutions in the sector where students would happily trade up and go to. So when we have reductions in the level of student demand, whether it's international or domestic, it actually affects some institutions more than others. So it's actually the sorts of institutions that can't typically attract the same levels of international students as they'd like to. We're actually the most vulnerable ones because of this interplay, this competition for students amongst the sector.
Obviously, we are in somewhat uncharted waters. I mean, maybe we'll all come through. But one of the things that I have become very aware of, and that I'm sure is true of everybody listening to this, never mind on the panel, is that we don't have much experience to use. We can't go, oh, well, we did this a couple of years ago there and that was fine. And I'd therefore like to turn to Neil now and ask him a little bit about the legal framework, about how far, if things come to the point where an institution is insolvent, how far does our current legal and regulatory structure give either the institution or its creditors or the government? Because although universities are not public sector institutions, they are, of course, not institutions that any government can or will ignore if things get really bad. So, Neil, how well prepared are we in a legal and regulatory sense for insolvencies if they arrive?
Thanks, Alison. Well, I think the short answer to that is not very well prepared from a legal perspective. The reason I say that is that for the majority of providers in the sector, there is not actually a suitable insolvency process in situ if one is needed. And that is because the majority of providers in the sectors are not companies, and therefore they don't fall under the companies or the insolvency legislation. And therefore, the processes that you might tend to use in other sectors like administration, possibly a restructuring plan or a company voluntary arrangement, are simply not available as a matter of law. What we do have at the moment is compulsory liquidation, which on its own is not going to be suitable to trade a university in any way because it is a terminal process. You could, like Carillion, Thomas Cook, British Steel, you could have a compulsory liquidation with a special manager, being a firm of accountants like PwC who would actually manage the university on a day-to-day basis. But those are very rare and have only arisen in very specific circumstances. So very untested, would involve the Insolvency Service being another government agency. And we just don't know how that would work as a matter of law. If there is a secured lender, then they could enforce their security by appointing fixed charge receivers over fixed charge assets. But again, those receivers can only deal with the assets, either bricks and mortar. They don't have the actual ability to trade a university, and that clearly is what you would need in these circumstances, most probably in a wind down situation. So in answer to your question, there's a severe lack of insolvency process options available to the sector at the moment as things currently stand.
And are there any lessons to be learned from particularly the FE sector, which I know does have distinctive legislation? Is that the sort of thing that the government should be thinking of bringing in at speed, or is it not really relevant or adequate?
I think you raise a very relevant issue, which is speed. I personally believe that the government should bring in a special administration regime for higher education, but I'm conscious of how long that might take, and whether actually by the time it was to be brought in force, a number of headwinds that we're talking about at the moment may actually have passed. But the reason I say that I think the sector would benefit from special administration is not so much around the actual administration itself. It would be useful to put a number of these providers into administration as a matter of law if that's what they required, because it would assist, I think, on winding down their operations. But whilst administration in other sectors allows you effectively to trade through and come out the other side, I don't think realistically with universities, if you have a provider in the sector who is an insolvency practitioner, students, frankly, are not going to be queuing up to apply to that university in the future. So I think you're only going to be looking at the situation where you're winding down a university's affairs and teaching out students that you have and transitioning those students over to another provider. But I think special administration would provide a more streamlined process than we currently have. I think anything would be more streamlined than what we currently have. But I think actually the legislation around special administration would assist in a number of other areas. Firstly, from trustees' point of view, when I advise trustees and I say to them, these laws might apply and they might visit personal liability on you, but they might not. That is an incredibly unhelpful thing for a legal advisor to be saying to those individuals. Yes, you might have personal liability, but I can't really tell if you do or don't. It's not the kind of thing that ideally people want to pay lawyers for. So I think it would help in providing some clarity around duties. It would also help, I think, in introducing a specific duty in the best interests of students, because that is not something contained in the current companies or insolvency legislation. Students may well be creditors, and therefore the directors, trustees would owe a duty to them as creditors, but nothing more than that. And I think it would be helpful to protect the students to have some duty in their favour. And my last point is possibly a perverse point, but I think actually it would assist in funding, particularly with lenders to the sector. It is a confused picture for lenders where they have security as to how they might recover their money. It's highly unlikely that those lenders are going to look to enforce their security and bring the closure of a university, but they don't currently have a clear line of sight as to what steps they could take if they needed to. And that inevitably, I think, influences their lending decisions into the sector. So I think a clearer line of sight on enforcement would actually give a clearer line of sight to funding.
Before I bring in Jess and Steve, I'd like to sort of have a follow-up question to the two of you related to this, which is that, of course, there have been institutions that have hit terrible trouble in the past. I mean, you know, the one of the obvious ones is Cardiff, which did have effectively bankruptcy staring itself in the face and has come through the other side and is a successful Russell Group university and so on. And we've also had a number of FE colleges. Only one, I think you said, ever went into full administration. You know, but there have been cases where institutions have been in terrible trouble. Are there no real lessons, no guidelines that come out of how they were coped with, or was it a sort of muddle through?
I think it's a closed door situation where you're looking to find a solution through a restructuring. The advantage of that in relation to continued trading, as I touched on earlier, is that you avoid an insolvency process, which is public. And if you're going to the market of students and to a certain extent their parents, because we're talking about financial obligations here as well, they're not going to be rushing to the university that's gone into an insolvency process. So the ability to do things behind closed doors and reach a consensus is preferable. It is what's going on in the market at the moment. It may or may not result in talk of mergers and things like that. I think they have their own logistical difficulties, but I think there are solutions to be found outside formal insolvency processes. But the question is obviously, what if a formal insolvency process is needed?
And your sense is that we should have, at the very least, some form of special administration process for if it's required.
Yes.
Damien, anything to add to that? And then I'd like to ask Steve for his view.
Yeah, certainly. Look, I'm very much behind there being a new bespoke insolvency regime for HE. There are learnings from many other sectors, and also, Alison, to your point, the past, which are relevant to it. But if we look at it's not just their FE, I was going to say social housing and also health, with the Health and Social Care Act, with trust special administrations. Now, interestingly, the Health and Social Care Act and how trust special administrations take place protects patients. And I think there are some learnings for that in the protection of students in how a regime works. And I think the protection of students is critical because the UK is, and I think needs to remain, a safe place to study for international and domestic students. And one of my worries about there not being a bespoke insolvency regime in place is the uncertainty, what that might mean for students, and this ripple effect across the sector if an institution or a small number of institutions were to become insolvent.
Steve, could I bring you in at this point and just ask how it looks from the perspective of somebody who has run a successful university for many years, has had a UUK perspective across the sector. Does it feel to you as if the major lack is in special administration regimes, clarity on student protection plans or whatever, or is it more that it's always going to be quite a lot of it fudging behind closed doors and you're not sure that anybody has really faced up to that?
Fudging behind closed doors is how it feels at the minute. We're not really grasping the reality of the situation. So my starting place is some of your earlier questions are we prepared for what's coming? Absolutely not. I don't think government is prepared. I don't think the sector is prepared. And I don't think really people have thought this through. So my first, wish on a stick would be, for goodness sake, let's get in the same room at the same time with decision makers and do a bit of scenario working, a bit of wargaming if you want, because I think it's very complex, and we're talking about complexity both within the human dimension, so students clearly at the heart of all of this, but staff, economic, the impact of the local economics to our cities and our regions, but also to the organisation itself, and then the knock-on consequence across a sector, clearly with the banks and lenders thinking about how safe a bet is higher education, and then finally reputation, and that reputational piece is global reputation in terms of what UK higher education stands for. And I don't think we have really seriously, government and sector and regulators, really got our heads around that. And I agree with the other colleagues who have sort of suggested that actually legally we're not necessarily supported in thinking this stuff through, because we are different sorts of organizations. So when we look at this through the lens of an organization, and I have this conversation in the university, you know, if we were to be in a situation where we're insolvent, we can't pay our bills, unlike other organizations, we have to ensure that our students are protected. That could take 5 years. Switch the lights off, but that's 5 years of following students through, maybe longer, depending on the programs of study they're on. And it may or may not be possible to place those students in another institution. And that hugely depends on where that insolvency happens. In London, well, that's a very different space. There are many, many institutions. But outside London, that's not the case. And for many students, actually, they can't travel. They're regionally located, locally located. So this is massive. And I do think that you know, the headwinds that we have been engaging with up until now, including COVID. So this has been 5-6 years of continuous pressure. Universities have done as much probably, you know, as we can in terms of trying to sort it out ourselves. The pressure's there, it's getting worse. And we need action in terms of being able to engage collectively to ensure that we do the right things that protect both the human endeavours, the economic and reputational. And if we lose sight of that, we will have half-baked solutions that will not work.
I'm interested that so far nobody has actually mentioned government or politics. And I'd like to turn to Jess now, because in a way it seems to me that what, you know, with two things here. I mean, Neil has said it would be great to have a regime, but it will take too long. Steve has said we need to face up to things. We need to sort of talk about it as a sector. We need to be aware that this could be a 5-year thing. Are the politicians, are the civil servants really thinking this through? And if they aren't, is that the sector's fault? Clearly, it's, you know, again, there's this reluctance to do things too publicly, because that implies that things are really bad, quite possibly implies they're worse than they are. On the other hand, if you don't talk about it, then you're not ready. And I completely take your point, Steve, that if an institution really does cease to operate, you are talking about 5 years of seeing people through. And if you don't want to do that, but you are aware that there are going to be really serious issues and creditors, then you have to have some sort of plan. Jess, what is the politics of this? Is anybody really thinking about it seriously?
So I think I am sure, or at least I'm hopeful, that there is a lot of this sort of wargaming and planning and scenario sort of gazing happening in the DfE and elsewhere. But what it lacks is the sort of ministerial and governmental direction for what they want to do and what they would like the sector to look at as it comes out the other side of this. Because all of this is predicated on a series of political questions. Having a market-led system for higher education is a political choice. Choosing to let an institution go bust or not will be a political choice, as well as a sort of economic reality. The higher education funding system in the round, you know, the sort of flatlining of domestic fees, these are all very big P political questions, and they're quite fraught political questions, because to make change is to sort of choose and decide, winners and pick losers, essentially. And the way we have been thinking about this is mainly sort of following on from Steve's point. Which institutions would you save and which would you not? The knock-on impact of a sort of institutional collapse in London would be enormous for students, but less so on the place than in sort of some of our more regional rural towns, places where a single institution is a large scale not just education provider, but it provides jobs. It's a supply chain impact, knock-on impact on housing, on local economies, akin to a large, industrial private, more traditional private sector company going bust that you would see in the news. And that sort of level of political intervention is really going to have to match the sort of scale of the problem. What the government has not done yet is set out any of its tests. Whether you would have a test for economic growth, whether you would have one for place, whether you would look at potential impact on public services, on educational skills in the round, on science and research, on the specialism of an institution. Again, all of these things have to be considered. And what I worry about most is at the minute the system we have is set up to consider them on a case-by-case basis. Yeah. And I think from what we've had from all the panelists is that this is snowballing into a world in which you are not going to have time, capacity. We haven't even spoken on this call about organisations like the OFS and what its role would be in a sort of institutional failure, for want of a better word. But if we currently have a system that says, okay, when an institution goes bust, we have a plan, the OFS will do this, government will do this, and we'll do it one at a time. If you have, what happens if you have 5? What happens if you have 10? What happens if you have 15? And again, the sort of political will and the resources needed to go into that, I don't sort of see at the minute. And then the flip side of that is if we currently have a very sort of hands-off political approach, we can see this. Jackie Smyth spent a lot of time at Labour conference sort of acknowledging the problem and promising a solution at some point, but that it was a difficult question, which is a non-answer if you've ever sort of heard one from a politician. But if we currently have that sort of acknowledgement but hands-off approach, what would a more proactive interventionist government approach look like? And would the sector like it? University autonomy is a very sort of prized thing across the sector, and lots of the solutions will see an erosion of that autonomy, whether it's sort of transformation funds for loans, things like sort of restructuring regimes. Money from government will come with strings. That means institutions will not be able to operate with the autonomy that they currently have. Any government would want to sort of pivot and point that direction to its wider goals, some of which may mean quite radically changing provision in an institution, the type of institution, the level of courses it teaches, and things like that. And the final thing to sort of flag and raise, which has come up in a lot of the conversations we've had about this, is it possible for the government to intervene too far? So one of the concerns when we speak to sort of colleagues at the department is what happened in the FE sector, which was a sort of reclassification of further education colleges from private sector to public sector, which had enormous implications for their ability to borrow, their ability to finance themselves. And it was a real sort of overnight decision, really. It's out of government control. It's a sort of ONS choice. And as far as we can tell, there is no threshold or sort of rules for the point at which the higher education would sort of tip into that reclassification moment, but it is all predicated around the amount of government intervention, government support that sort of goes into the sector beyond the sort of system that we have at the moment. So even if we get that sort of direction from government and support and loans and changes, could that have a sort of tipping point moment where we see a much bigger sort of transformation sector as a whole than we might expect?
Okay, so lots and lots of things to worry about. I have a couple of questions in the chat, which I think are highly relevant to everything that everybody's said so far. one very general question, as in, except for you, Jess, just now, there's been very little said about the Office for Students, which I think partly reflects the fact that the Office for Students was created as something actually quite different from HEFSI, with no official system responsibilities. And secondly, sort of coming down from that, a much more specific question, which is at the other end of it, really, and it's about the speed with which things happen. Is the current 30 days liquidity benchmark for a reportable event to OFS, is that right? Is that adequate in the current environment? It does sort of feel as though, first of all, this is personal. My sense is that when things happen, they always happen faster than anybody expects, never quite where they expected. And therefore, I'm a bit skeptical about tests for whether or not the government would do X really happening. Again, this is partly from experience in the FE sector. When things do go belly up, it's always chaos, but they don't actually close you down. But equally, this sense that there is a component missing, that there is nobody really who can look at the system overall in even a semi-public way, and not by so doing risk terrifying everybody, because there's the contagion risk. Steve, Damien, can I take, and everybody else as well, but can I start with you on those two questions?
Sure, Steve, would you like to start?
Yeah, if I kick off with the OFS, because I was sort of there right at the beginning, and of course it's not the funding council, and it was set up to not be the funding council. That was the first rule, really. I guess my concern is that the world is changing very rapidly around them, and they are not changing in order to respond to that because of the way that they were set up. So when I look at the access participation plans, and then when I look at the protection plans in particular, in this scenario, I don't think they are fit for purpose. I don't see how on earth they will protect students in the event of insolvency. And therefore, we're deluding ourselves thinking that that's okay, tick, move on. So I do think that needs to be reconsidered and re-engaged with quite urgently. I also think that the complexity in universities' finances are multiple and varied. And of course, the liquidity question to some extent, can you pay your bills and have you got cash that you can draw on quickly? And will that help you? Well, that's one part of the picture, but we've also got some institutions that have got really massive debt behind them. Their gearing is pretty dangerous, in my view, and therefore they've got nowhere to go. They're not going to be able to borrow their way out of it. They are going to have to face some very difficult situations, including students who will be requesting, I'm sure, compensation and a whole raft of other things. So this gets very complicated very quickly. And I don't think the Office for Students in particular is geared up for that. I don't think that they have the capabilities, capacity, or bandwidth to be able to look at this. And remember that this is not just about England, although we're focusing on England. This is across the devolved nations as well. Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have very similar pictures emerging, maybe sometimes a little bit worse. So I think we've got a national issue here that will need to be responded to without necessarily, I go back to this, I don't think we've got the mechanisms to do this well. I think we're in the big unknown territory, and that feels pretty scary to me.
Damien?
Yeah, so look, I first of all say on the OFS that we've got a significant change in the financial risk profile of the sector, and I think that does need a different regulatory approach as a result. And I'm for a more interventionist approach. And although that might fill some institutions with dread, I think it's in the sector's best interests. And that is because we need a more interventionist approach to support prior to the point where insolvency is reached, but also understand which institutions are close and how far off they are. And it's in the whole sector's interest that the OFS is interventionist to avoid any institution reaching insolvency in the first place. So I'm very much for an evolution in the OFS I think the 30-day liquidity point, I think measures of liquidity are overall quite useful and directional, but the 30-day point, I think for me, could be sort of used a little bit out of context. So for example, you can have institutions with 30 days of liquidity, but let's just say in month 2 or month 3, they've got a bank that wants all of the debt repaid. Well, they can have liquidity on paper, but they are actually technically insolvent today. So I think we need some quite sophisticated measures of liquidity, how long institutions have got left to be able to understand the window of opportunity with which to intervene. And then I do think the sector as a whole does need some support to bring about some change, and whether that's some form of overall commissioner that I think Public First have helpfully published in their report a few months ago. But I do think something which helps accelerate both the change in OFS and also any other national structures, so the sector can help look after itself with a bit of support, is really important. If we don't have it, we're taking a big risk.
Can I just come in very quickly on that, which is the report we published, my colleague Jonathan Simons published. We did put in there a sort of call for a higher education commissioner to be the sort of captain of the ship between the department, the sector and the regulator. And it was probably the most controversial thing it's not a very controversial report, but it was the thing we had the most sort of comment and feedback from people saying, that's nonsense. You don't need another sort of individual here. It should be the OFS's job. It should be the minister's job. It should be the Secretary of State's job. That's their role. But I think the complexity of this, to our mind, required someone with that oversight from both sides, both sort of regulatory and the political, to sort of make some of these political decisions I spoke about a little bit earlier.
I think that's a very interesting suggestion, actually, and I think one of the things which I haven't heard anybody say actually OFS is just fine, doesn't need any rethink at all. I'm not hearing that from anyone. Neil, could I come to you specifically on this question of students actually having a legal case, among other things, and the fact that student protection plans, again, I'm hearing from Steve and Shitij, I don't know whether you would agree that the current regime is really it's not going to be adequate if we actually have any major failures. Students have, for very obvious reasons, become much more inclined to turn to litigation. And it does seem to me that if you have a situation even in which a university doesn't close down totally, but actually effectively has to stop a large number of courses, you do have a major issue. And again, I'd like to take an analogy from the sector that I've worked for many years, which is training and further education, where independent training providers have a habit of going bankrupt with monotonous regularity. And there is no clear regime, but an awful lot of time and public money is spent finding new placements for people when things go belly up. Now, these tend to be fairly small numbers of people. If you compare that with, say, a major university, is that something which the sector should indeed be concerned about?
Yes, I think just coming back to student protection plans, and the two are slightly linked. Student protection plans are not fit for purpose. I think that's pretty evident. Having seen them, a lot of them are very simply drafted. So I think there is a precedent doing the rounds and people are just filling in. A lot of the answer to the question of what happens if you are into financial distress is we're not in financial distress, which isn't really answering the question, but that tends to be the answer that's provided. And I appreciate that providers are putting this on their website, so they don't necessarily want to publicly demonstrate to people that they may or may not have any financial difficulties. But what the OFS are requiring behind closed doors, and are thankfully not asking providers to put on their website, is a more detailed market exit plan. And so I think the message to providers in situations where they may be facing financial distress is that that's what they've really got to be looking at, a more detailed plan. Market exit may be a bit of a scary description for it, but a more detailed plan about what would happen. And then that links into your point, Alison, regarding the students. I mean, there is no formal protection for students, as we've talked about. But that plan really should be looking at, if we had to go into an insolvency process and wind down, where would our students actually go? Merger partners, all of these things need to be considered. And the OFS is requiring providers to look at these situations. We have acted on assignments where the OFS has been very stringent on these issues. So I think they are things that providers need to be looking at. We acted for a provider called Augar a couple of years ago that went into liquidation. That was a company with 250 students, and those students moved over to another provider, Rose Bruford. But compared to the numbers we're talking about in relation to universities in the main, that's very small beer. And trying to place those students in one provider, I think, is going to be a very difficult thing to do. But these are thought processes that providers do need to be thinking about in more detail, and the OFS will require them to do so to the extent they're in financial distress.
Shitij. Yeah, can you unmute?
That is good advice, to unmute before one speaks. Can I just build on what has been said and make 3 quick points? One is that, someone made a mention of replacing students. I think we've got to realize universities don't provide a product, they provide 400 products. You cannot take a student who's studying BSc biomedicine and say, we'll find you some BSc elsewhere in our system or in someone else's system. You're not serving them if you're just placing them another degree. So that bespoke matching is a thing that rarely other market, failures have to deal with. So that's point number 1. The second thing to keep in mind is not only will we have the usual contagion, which other sectors also might face when there is a problem, we will have a simultaneous collapse in demand, which makes sustaining. So you know what, if Thames Water or whatever name is on your lips at the moment goes, the number of water consumers are still the same, the number of water need is still the same. UK has such a big higher education input, international input into our higher education sector. We will immediately see a vanishing demand. And it will vanish not across a particular university or a subset of universities, it'll practically vanish from all our universities. And you can see that example in Canada, where the government put a blanket of saying that we'll have 1/3 less international students. And you would think it would only selectively work on the institutions that were being targeted. No, it's across the board the demand falls, because someone who's sitting in New Delhi and Shanghai cannot distinguish between the many fine British universities. They just don't come to the UK. But the last point is that I think we are at an interesting pivotal moment where the market-led approach to higher education in the UK has reached a moment of its natural reckoning. This is how you expect the markets to work. This is what, Schumpeter was all about. This is the moment of the so-called creative destruction. So the question is, if we are to continue with this market-led model, there needs to be very clear rules, which I think Neil and Damien, that you were both talking about, which would give assurance to all of us that we can use that creative destruction to a better future rather than just more destruction. And I think it is clear that those rules, which probably work for the rest of the market, are just not there for universities. So in some sense, this is a natural moment in this model. We shouldn't be surprised. Why are we here? This is where this model should have brought us. We probably just didn't think through all the things we need to have in place for a time such as this.
That's I think, an upbeat response.
It's a call for action.
I'd like to circle around a little bit, though, because I think that one of there are 2 issues. I'd like to come back to sort of contagion and how we seem to the rest of the world before we close, but I would like to come back to something that I think, I can't remember who it was, raised it right at the beginning, which is that our institutions are in some places clustered and in other places highly spread out. And this goes back to the fact that the OFS at the moment does not have a system view. And it seems to me that we know, in fact, because after all, London did lose a university, and the waters closed over it, and it was not really an issue. But in many parts of the country, if the sole university in a large area closes or is in really acute trouble, it's not just the risk of contagion to other people, it's actually also that they are producing a large number of really important professionally qualified people for the local labour market. And I mean, my own sense, I'm going to ask Stephen and Jess this because you're probably freer to speculate than the other two. My sense is that actually when it comes to where governments will step in, it has far more to do with geography than with having a shakeout of the system in order to have different evolving institutions, which might make a lot of sense in the long term. But I'd be interested if you share this sense that bluntly there are geographical areas where you just don't let it close down, either for raw politics or for labour market reasons. And that also is not built into the current system. Nobody is actually saying, well, it doesn't really matter if we've got some institutions on the brink in London, because we can actually, behind closed doors, merge, sort it out, it won't matter. It really does matter if this chunk of the country is effectively left without a properly functioning institution. Steve, Jess,
well,
are you willing to go there?
In previous times, there was a university that was going to be closed, and the minister suddenly, having been lobbied hard, woke up and went, ouch, we can't let this happen. So instructed the then chief executive of the funding council to get it sorted. And I think the line was, with what shall I sort it, minister? Because you need to give me money to do that. And I suspect we're in the same place again. But I think you're right. It is really interesting. This is where government initiatives and agendas are going to crunch into each other. So we've got a massive shortage in some parts of the country in respect of key skills for medicine, for health, and huge shortages. Well, the response to that is, let's open more medical schools. Let's make sure that we cover those areas. Now, what would happen if one of those institutions then suddenly got itself into a situation where it's not solvent? I can't think of any minister that would then not want to intervene. So I think you're right. There will be political decisions that will be made, which will be around the government imperative to make sure some things stay and deliver. And there'll be others where they may take a view, well, we've got lots in this area, we'll let that one fall. And it's a similar sort of approach that's happened in FE. If we look back in FE land, where we've had mergers of FE colleges, they have to be relatively geographically close to each other to stand any chance. And of course, with FE, you can be much more interventionist in terms of the approach. My final comment in terms of the logistics of all of this, it is about boards allowing executives and themselves to have open conversations early enough. When it's in crisis, it's too late. You actually want to have some of these conversations way, way earlier than that. And of course, we all know that many boards protect to the bitter end their organisation and their institution, even when they're facing into serious issues. And I would much prefer us to have conversations which are around, how do we get 2 + 2 to equal 5 if we come together early enough, or if we look at how we collaborate differently? That is not something that the sector is good at doing.
Yeah, I'm not sure other sectors are too, looking at both private sector and charity more generally. But I do think it's a real issue that institutions look in and put up the barriers and hope they'll sort it out. And in this context, I mean, a number of people have said, well, suppose we had very sensible comments if we believe in rational long-term policy making under crisis. Should we have more distinctive types of universities? Would that sort it? Would that mean that some of them are freed from certain pressures? Are there just too many? Are we being asked to have too many students and we could fund? I mean, Jess, what do you feel of the politics of it? Am I being unduly pessimistic in feeling that what we will probably actually get is, if we're lucky, moderately effective response in crisis?
There's loads I could say here. Where shall I start? So I think one of the things to be blunt that is a challenge is that we have a bit of as Shitij said, a sort of system failure. A point in the system that we have where lots of institutions are in financial distress for a sort of combination of seen and unforeseen things. We also have some institutions which are just been badly managed, or have not managed themselves as well as they could do, whether that's sort of poor governance, bad bets, and picking those two apart when you are a government trying to decide who and how to save. Again, these are things that we don't really like to talk about because we're all very collegial in higher education, and we sort of want to say that everyone is as good as each other. But some institutions are going to go bust because they've made poor choices. And is it the role of government to step in and intervene there? And how do they decide? Should some institutions sort of double down on their specialism? I think one of the things, again, we haven't even had time to cover here is the system as a whole about to expand or shrink? Is it going to try and expand provision, get more students in, ride the wave that way, whether it's domestic or international, or are places about to be cut, or institutions about to be cut? And sort of nothing makes politicians more nervous than the mailbag of complaints from mums of students, I think, or the world in which parents suddenly find the university place for Timmy with his 4 Bs at A-level doesn't exist anymore because the domestic sort of side has shrunk to an extent that the sort of sector we recognise at the minute doesn't exist. And the third, just to finish on a almost completely different point, is we've talked a lot today about institutions going bust and being saved or not. The other thing we've been thinking a little bit about probably first is what is the step in between that, and is there any incentive for mergers or sort of institutions to sort of rescue each other, to provide that lifeboat? And what does that look like? The 2 weak institutions merging with each other makes a larger weak institution, and is there enough incentive from government, and this is where government would need to step in, for a strong institution to rescue a weak one, and what does that look like? And I don't think this is definitely a paper that I would love to sort of see is what do the models look like there? What are the options on the table for a world in which we start to see institutions if not specialize but sort of start to merge into each other?
I think sorry, Alison, can I just pick up one point Steve made very briefly about getting ahead of the curve and preparing. Just to be clear, I mean, insolvency is not a bad thing. It's a pejorative term, but in advising a number of providers in the sectors, I think there's a feeling that if someone tells you that you're insolvent, you've got to go and tell your friends and family about that, which you don't. There are a lot of insolvent businesses out in the market. That in itself is not an issue. It's how you respond to that to hopefully avoid an insolvency process, which obviously would be a much worse thing.
I mean, I think you're clearly right, Neil, but it's also true, of course, that this also goes to the process and if you are insolvent, then who goes in? And I think also the sector's concern about, well, not so much contagion, but reputation. Is this something that's really serious? And so I suppose my question there is, I mean, normally if you're insolvent, or particularly if you have a special administration regime, the assumption is that you've got competent people to put in. And I think that does link back to Jess's question. I mean, is there anything in our current regime that would actually encourage a stronger institution to take over a weaker institution? I have to say it's not obvious to me. Steve, you're shaking your head.
No, there's no real incentive.
No.
What would happen under those circumstances is the stronger institution clearly would want to protect its own interests. We're living in a world with league tables and goodness knows what else, and we compare ourselves not only to national but international. So nobody's going to knowingly walk into taking your eye off those balls. Therefore, I think you would have to look at how to incentivize an institution to accept the risks, and also work out the model. I mean, there are different models that I've looked at in terms of this sort of situation, in terms of a group structure that protects the brand of the main institution and then has a separate institution under a group model so that you can maintain differentials and all of those things, because inevitably you're trying to put two things together that weren't necessarily designed to be put together. So you have to try and protect it in a way, both reputationally, legally, and financially, doesn't sink the overall brand that you're trying to protect, which is the stronger brand, clearly. And that's not easy. That isn't easy. There are ways of doing it, but it requires some pump priming. Because the other thing, when you're in this situation, the money flows are not likely to be that easy. So the students that are in the system, you've probably lost that money already. So how are we going to then model, how do you get this to work going forward? And that takes time and energy to work that bit through, believe me.
I'm conscious that we've only got 4 minutes left. I'm going to throw one other comment into the pot, and then I'm going to take everybody, starting with Shitij, Jess, Damien, Neil, and Steve. You can have the last word if there's something you forgot to say just now. But the thing I want to throw into the pot, actually, just briefly, is something which, again, a couple of people have raised in the chat, which was that at the time that COVID first hit, there was a real worry that institutions were going to go broke. And the government came up with a restructuring regime, which was designed to be so unappealing that nobody would want to do it if they weren't forced to. And in the end, nobody was forced to, partly because, of course, the students with nothing else to do decided that they might as well study from their bedrooms, bluntly. But what is interesting to me there was that the motive force of the Treasury was to make it as unappealing as possible. That's gross simplification. Anybody from Treasury is listening, I know that's a gross simplification, but it's not entirely untrue either. So I'm not sure what we learned from that, except that there is an acute worry within government about what all of this will cost. At which point, with even less time to go, Shitij, Jess, Damien, Neil, Steve, you have 30 seconds each.
So, look, my call would be that if some elements of the university sector are expected to help support other elements of the university sector through this transition, then the government has to tell us what tomorrow and day after will look like. Because it's very difficult, even for the strong, to lend out their hand and make the bets, unless they know how research and education will be funded in this country 5 years from now. Without that clarity, it's very hard to go out and help anyone.
Jess.
Yeah, to echo Shitij, I think we currently lack the direction government wants to take and the answers it thinks it wants to have, not just in the immediate crisis, but in the longer term. The other thing we lack is really any spare cash lying around to make any of these changes. All of these things cost government money, and I don't know if you've sort of, unless you've been in a bunker, the only thing we've heard for the last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years is that there is no money available. So what is the trade, and is higher education actually sitting at the bottom of that priority list, which means we're going to end up sort of in this stasis holding pattern for a lot longer than I think we all want.
Damien.
I'd say some form of transformation fund is helpful here to incentivise collaboration, maybe partnerships and mergers, but also support some of the most challenged to buy time for a bespoke insolvency regime to be put in place. I'd also say for any institution listening to this, if you're not at the point of insolvency, but you're very worried, take advice, financial and legal. We haven't covered today some of the legal side that Neil knows all about in terms of director's responsibilities and so forth, but also the chance to do a financial restructuring prior to the point of insolvency and take cost out more rapidly, but in a way that doesn't affect the quality to students. So Alison, I'd say those things are key.
Neil.
And echo that planning ahead in relation to your question, Alison. I mean, the figures are big. But I think the figures in relation to government funding in respect of an either planned or unplanned insolvency process are enormous. So in comparison, I think that the amount of money required in supporting institutions to avoid an insolvency process, and however that looks like, are going to be a lot less than the result of an insolvency process itself.
And Steve.
Yeah, I agree with all of those things. So I'll try and do something different. I think we need an immediate piece which is about stabilizing. What we've seen happening this this intake in particular, if we can't solve it through international, domestically, we've seen huge disruption. And frankly, we've seen the waterfall, institutions in higher positions dipping down into tariff levels that they would not normally be dipping down into. That is going to create huge instability and quicken the pace. And that worries me, because then we're dealing with 2 or 3 very difficult marketplaces all at the same time. So let's get, maybe student number controls are the answer, but some sort of intervention.
Right. They were also discussed at the time of COVID, and in the end, we didn't well, we had some voluntary number controls then, actually. So that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody. I feel there is enormous food for thought here. Lots of things which it would be good to pull together in a more formal way. We will obviously at King's try to do that a bit. Hopefully UK and everybody here, since you're all sort of major players in this. And let's hope that we don't all disappear over Niagara before we can get some of it sorted. Thank you very, very much, everybody. Thank you to everybody who was listening. Apologies for those who asked questions that I wasn't able really to throw to the panel. But as I said, a lot of food for thought, and enormous thanks to the panel for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.